So today we're talking about the canine biceps brachii, why it's different from the human biceps. The humans has two heads, the dog's only has one, so technically it's a unicep. We'll talk about why we still call it a bicep, what its functions are for the dog, a little bit more into what the anatomy is like, where is it coming from, where is it going, what issues does it face because of that, what advantages it has to the dog compared to the human biceps, and how it functions for us. So stay tuned. So the canine biceps brachii is the first of three cranial brachial muscles we'll be talking about. The others are the brachialis and the coracobrachialis. We're starting with the biceps because it's probably the most important of the three. The brachialis does some functions, but not as much as the biceps, and the coracobrachialis is not nearly as significant. But let's talk about why it's called a biceps and not a uniceps, because it only has one head. So technically it is a uniceps, but we call it the biceps because typically we name things based on human anatomy and like muscles that are similarly located to the human skeleton or human musculoskeletal system, and also based on nerve innervation. So both of the human biceps and the canine biceps are innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. So they're kind of in the same area, you know, they're on the arm. The dog's is located a bit deeper than the humans. The dog's is located a bit more medially than the humans. It only has one head, but it's still roughly comparable. So with that nerve innervation, we call it a bicep. And this extends to other muscles as well. So in the dog, the triceps has four heads, whereas obviously in the humans, it has three. That's why we call it a tricep. So you kind of got to know a little bit more about the muscle to know a little bit more about its actual anatomy than just the name in the dog. But that's all right. We're going to go into that. So this is not an uncommon injury for the dog. And when we look at what functions it does for the dog and exactly how it's located, it'll probably make a little bit more sense as to how this muscle, or more specifically its tendon, could get injured. So there's basically three functions that the biceps brachii does for the dog. The first, and probably the most important, is to stabilize the shoulder. So the glenohumeral joint, or the shoulder joint, where the scapula comes down and meets the humerus, right, with the glenoid cup or glenoid cavity of the scapula meeting the head of the humerus here. It's a little bit of an unstable joint. It's what's called an incongruent joint, and that means that these two bones, the head of the humerus, the glenoid cavity on the scapula, don't really fit together perfectly. The head of the humerus is actually larger than the glenoid cavity. So unlike, say, the hip joint, right, it's not really a perfect fit, and that makes it more unstable. It also can lead to more movement, which presents some advantages for the dog, but again, it is more unstable. There's also a lot of ligaments here helping to hold this in place. There's the medial glenohumeral ligament here, because again, we're looking at the medial left forelimb. So we're looking at, here's the left forelimb, again in the dog. This is like a leg for them, basically. Well, it is a leg, but for us it's an arm. So if I put my arm down to simulate a leg, we're on the medial side here, and on the left limb. So again, so these medial glenohumeral ligaments here on this side, and on the other side is the lateral glenohumeral ligaments, are kind of weak. So the shoulder joint really relies on a lot of the muscles and tendons around it to stabilize it. So the biceps being one of those main muscles and tendons that helps to stabilize the shoulder. So this is the cranial side of the shoulder here, right? So this is, the dog's head would be over here, tail's over here, cranial, caudal. So here on the cranial side is the side of the shoulder that the biceps tendon is on. So the biceps tendon is going to stop the humerus from making unnecessary cranial movement, which is really important for the dog, especially like when you're going to stop, do a lot of explosive movements. This tendon will get put under quite a bit of load here, and do quite a bit of work for the dog. Moving on to its secondary function is going to be to flex the elbow. So just like in the human, the biceps flexes the elbow. In the dog, though, it's a little bit different. It's going to flex the elbow at certain times. So it's going to flex the elbow. Essentially, if the dog is standing, when it goes to then pick up its leg, that's when it's going to flex the elbow. So it's going to flex the elbow to pick up the leg to then take the next step, which actually goes back to when the biceps is firing. So actually, we should probably take a step back and talk a little bit more about its primary function, or at least its first function, to stabilize the shoulder. I don't want to say primary and make it sound like these aren't important functions. They are. So maybe it has a couple primary functions. But going back again to stabilizing the shoulder. So when does the bicep stabilize the shoulder? So it stabilizes the shoulder when the dog is static, when it's not moving. There's not going to be a ton of strain put on it at that point. And that's a pretty easy task to accomplish. But it's also active, stabilizing the shoulder a lot while the dog is moving. So when the dog is moving, the stance phase is basically from when the dog puts its limb down to when it then picks the limb back up to take the next step. So there's different categories of muscles. Some are active at the beginning, like the first half when the dog puts their foot down. Some are active the second half when the dog picks their foot up. And the biceps is one of a third category of muscles that's active the entire time through that stance phase. The other muscles are the serratus ventralis, I believe the flexor digitorum profundus, and the deltoid, and the supraspinatus as well. So, and there might be one more, but we'll move on. Anyway, so it's doing quite a bit of work here, stabilizing the shoulder through that whole phase. So it's definitely one of the harder workers during that period of time. So if we come down here again as well, when the bicep flexes the elbow, it's again when the dog touches down, when it's through the stance phase, when it picks up. So when it picks up, the limb is actually going to be behind it, right? So as it's pushing off, it's picking up, and the arm's extended. The biceps then flexes the elbow to bring the foot forward to take the next step. So it's not quite as much about flexing the elbow to, say, go upstairs. The brachialis probably does a little bit more work in that, but the biceps is definitely an elbow flexor, and definitely one of the main elbow flexors in the dog. It also works to extend the shoulder, right? So, meaning to protract the shoulder, so to extend the shoulder forward in the dog when it's taking its steps, running, trotting, galloping. The dog is going to extend the shoulder, and the biceps is going to play a minor role in extending the shoulder. It's not its primary function, and it's not the main muscle doing that. Probably the brachiocephalicus is the main muscle as far as in forelimb extension. But the biceps does play a role there. I would say that's definitely a secondary function compared to elbow flexion and shoulder stabilization. But it's not that it's not that important. Let's talk a little bit more about the anatomy of the biceps. So the biceps originates here, which is the supraglenoid tubercle on the scapula. I think knowing what the words mean makes it easier to understand what's going on. So when we say supraglenoid tubercle, what we mean is it is supra, it's above, glenoid, the glenoid cavity here on the scapula, tubercle, like a round bony prominence. So again, above the glenoid on a bump. So supraglenoid tubercle, and that's where the biceps tendon originates. And it kind of comes down here cranially into what's called the intertubercular groove. So in a little bit, we'll look at the skeleton to look at the anatomy again on the bones, which would be a little bit more clear. But the intertubercular groove is going to be between the lesser and greater tubercles, and the biceps kind of makes a curve down into that groove, and it's held in place here by this connective tissue band called the transverse retinaculum. So the transverse retinaculum is helping to hold that biceps tendon in place, and it's also helping it to slide smoothly in that groove. So that's a very important function there, to keep the biceps in its place and to keep the biceps working really good. The muscle progresses craniomedially, so kind of like the front inside of the forearm of the dog, down to the humerus here. This is the humerus, down to the radius and the ulna, where the tendon splits, as you can see here. And the larger part of the tendon attaches to the ulna, and the little bit smaller part attaches to the radius. So it attaches to the radial tuberosity and the ulnar tuberosity, right? Makes sense, kind of bony prominence, something for a tendon to attach to on the radius, and on the ulna, ulnar tuberosity, radial tuberosity, 2 insertion points on both bones. If you want to flex, flex both of those bones, flex both of the forearm bones, you attach to both, you flex, originating from the shoulder. I think that makes sense. Again, this means that the biceps brachii in the dog is a biarticular muscle because it crosses the shoulder joint and the elbow joint. So some muscles cross one joint, some muscles cross multiple, and the biceps crosses multiple, which is partially why it does multiple things as well. So that makes sense. A lot of the muscle is not that palpatable in the dog, so I drew it here with just the biceps, but in reality, right, there's muscles covering this whole area here, and the pectorals, the superficial pectorals are going to actually come in here, kind of come over the bicep, and so a lot of this is going to be covered by the superficial pectorals, and there's also some of the other muscles in the area here, brachiocephalicus coming down, and so a lot of this muscle is going to be covered. It will be deep. It will not be superficial. This makes sense. Deep muscles usually play a bigger role in stabilization than more superficial muscles, right? Because they're closer to the bone. But you can get down to the biceps down here once it kind of descends distally past the superficial, descending and transverse pectorals. It's going to be much more palpatable down here. At the distal part of the muscle, down at the tendon of insertion, also down at the tendon of origin, you can definitely get into it a little bit. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about the muscle belly itself and the muscle type. So there's different types of muscles in the body. There's parallel muscles, there's circular muscles, there's pennate muscles. I don't know, there's a lot more. Anyway, and there'll be different types of muscles for different functions, depending on what's needed for the body. And so the human biceps and the canine biceps are 2 different types, and this will make a little bit of sense when we know what those types are, because they do perform certain different tasks. So actually, let's draw the human biceps. We'll just draw one of the heads. So the human biceps is what's called a parallel muscle. So that means that all these muscle fibers, fascicles, are running essentially in the same direction, from the tendon of insertion down to the tendon of origin. And that means these are pretty long muscle fibers. They're going to be a little bit weaker. They're going to be a little bit more flexible. They're going to have bigger range of motion. They're going to be better suited for fine motor skills, because these muscles can really pull up and down in a longer range because they are longer. So that's great for the type of tasks that we do as humans, right? You know, we're not relying on this for stabilization like we were a quadruped, like the dog, on all 4 limbs. And we do a lot more things with fine motor skills than the dog does, right? Things like drawing on a whiteboard that are less important to dogs. So actually, if we look at the human biceps, is more specifically a fusiform muscle, I believe, which is a type of parallel muscle, which means it's going to have kind of a larger body here, and it's going to taper down toward a tendon. So, whereas the dog is going to be a little bit different. So the dog is a bipennate muscle, which means that it's going to have a tendon here coming through it. We will go ahead and draw on this. So we're going to have a tendon coming down through the biceps, and the bicep muscle is going to be angled toward the tendon. So that's what's called pennation, right? So here if we have, I don't know why I erase things. Anyway, so here if we have the fusiform human biceps here, all these muscle fibers running up and down. And here we have the biceps brachii in the dog, which, we'll go with purple. These fibers are going to be at an angle to the longitudinal axis of the muscle, which is like a straight line going through the muscle, would be the longitudinal axis, So again, these muscle fibers are going to be at an angle to the longitudinal axis here, up and down the muscle. This will do a few things. It's going to make it stronger. So why is it going to make it stronger? Because we're going to have more muscle fibers, because they're shorter and they're packed in. More muscle fibers means more strength. Because they're at an angle here, though, it's going to have less flexibility. So it's going to have less flexibility. It'll have less range of motion when it contracts. It won't be able to contract as much as the human biceps because of this pennation angle here. It was not really that clear in the research on exactly what the pennation angle is in most dogs. In greyhounds, they did a study, and the pennation angle was 41 degrees for the biceps brachii, which is actually a pretty steep angle. So again, if the longitudinal axis is straight here, and you have fibers running straight, that would be 0 degrees. If you were straight across, that'd be 90. 45 would be here, so 41 is almost 45. So that's pretty steep. I think it would be a little bit less in most other dogs that aren't going to be as explosive as the greyhound is, but I couldn't find the... Alright, so our battery died, but we're back. Looking at the pennation angle here again, in greyhounds, it was 41 degrees. In other dogs, I'm going to guess it's less. But I couldn't find the exact pennation angle. So if anybody knows it, put it in the comments and let us all know. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. So let's go ahead and move on now and talk a little bit about muscle fiber types. So in the dog, it's going to have more type 1 muscle fibers than the human biceps. So the dog's is around 48% type 1. Hopefully you can see that and even possibly read my handwriting. The humans, I think it's more like 60% type 2. So that means the human biceps is going to be more geared toward explosive efforts, and the dog's is going to be a little bit more tailored for endurance. Not as much as some muscles. Like there are some muscles in the dog that are over 80% type 1. So the biceps is actually fairly balanced, but it's much more of a type 1 endurance muscle than the human biceps. When we say type 1, we means the muscle is going to be using a lot of aerobic respiration, so glucose and oxygen together to make ATP, to make energy. It's going to be slower to contract than a type 2 muscle. I mean, still really fast, but comparatively slower. But it will have better endurance. And if we look at how dogs function, I mean, dogs can run basically forever, right? So humans, we can be pretty good at endurance. We can certainly build ourselves up to doing things like ultra marathons, but dogs are much more born to do that. You know, think about the Iditarod and those type of long efforts. If you keep a dog properly fed, you keep them from overheating, they can just about run forever. And there's quite a bit of research on dogs and the ultimate running machines they are. So we'll go ahead and erase the human biceps for now, and we're going to talk a little bit more about agonist and antagonist pairs in muscle groups. So this is true with humans, it's true with dogs. There's going to be agonist and antagonist pairs, and there's a reason for that. So if we think about a muscle contraction, right? So my elbow flexes, the bicep contracts. Muscles don't really uncontract, right? So they use their energy to make a contraction. They're trading chemical energy for mechanical energy, and they're making that contraction. In this case, gravity will bring my elbow back down and extend the limb But if the gravity wasn't working for me, the triceps brachii here could contract and extend the elbow. So muscles work in those agonist-antagonist pairs as kind of a constant dance between them. So in the dog, as in the human, the triceps brachii over here is going to be its pair, its antagonist pair. When the biceps is the agonist, the triceps is the antagonist. And the triceps actually has 4 heads. So similar naming convention issues as with the biceps. The triceps in the human has 3 heads, so we call it a triceps in the dog. But in the dog, it actually has 4 heads. Some of those heads play a role in stabilization. Some play a role in movement. Overall, they're a very powerful muscle group. And so the biceps, that's another reason why it kind of needs this bipinnate structure, because it needs as much force as it can produce for its volume and size, because of the muscles, and the size of the muscle is going to be opposing in that agonist-antagonist dance between them. If the triceps is really hypertonic, meaning the muscle has too much tone, it's really tight, that can make it hard for the biceps, because that would mean the triceps wouldn't want to relax, and so the biceps would have to work harder, or its range of motion would be limited, and that's not uncommon to see, especially an older dog that may be overusing their triceps, and thus their gait is going to be a little bit more limited, along with a lot of other reasons, obviously. If we look a little bit more into relevant things, things that are relevant to this muscle, there are some acupuncture points that are on or around this muscle. There's a few, like lung 3, lung 4, I think pericardium 3. We're just going to mention probably the most important of them, which is going to be lung 5, which is going to be basically right down here. So that's going to be right here, basically in your elbow crease, the transverse cubital crease they call it, and it's going to be basically lateral to the biceps brachii tendon, but medial to the extensor carpi radialis, which is going to be coming up here, up the forelimb, the forearm, and so the biceps is going to be right there, just like in the human. Sorry, the lung 5 is going to be right there between the biceps and the extensor carpi radialis, just like in the human. It's a little bit easier if you like flex your arm. You can kind of feel in that crease there, and that's a very popular point, especially for descending lung qi, for clearing lung heat, tonifying lung yin. Probably one of like the main points on the lung channel after maybe lung 9, lung 7, kind of in there with lung 1. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. If you were trying to stretch the biceps, typically you would flex the shoulder and then extend the elbow. So you'd be flexing the shoulder back and extending the elbow. That's something someone might use diagnostically, or someone might be just kind of flexing, taking them through a passive range of motion to maintain muscle and joint health. You certainly wouldn't stretch beyond end range. You'd just be going within the range of motion that's comfortable, not trying to push through that, and you'd be doing it when the muscle is warm and relaxed. Massage can certainly benefit this muscle as well, especially if it's getting hypertonic because it's getting overworked. You could do some effleurage, stroking down the muscle to kind of warm it up and relax it. You could do some petrissage, kneading up and down the muscle, and especially if it's tight, a lot more like friction massage, going across the fibers, doing circles on the fibers, going up and down through the fibers, could be really, really useful to help to deal with hypertonicity, adhesions, and help keep the muscle itself healthy. There's also can be myofascial trigger points that can pop up in the biceps. Myofascial trigger points are going to be like basically muscle knots, so they're going to be like discrete. You wouldn't really see them by looking at it, is what that means. Little kind of bumps, if you will, located in a taut band of skeletal muscle. And there's 2 types of myofascial trigger points. One is going to be active. That means it's going to be causing pain all the time. So if you have like a knot on your body that always hurts you, that would be an active myofascial trigger point. If you have a spot where it doesn't cause any pain, but if you push on it, then it hurts, that would be what's called a latent myofascial trigger point. In the dog, there's 3 points typically, located a little more proximally, a little more in the middle, and a little more distal, going to be TP1, TP2, and TP3. So TP1 is going to be located here more proximally, and it's really going to refer to the shoulder. TP2 is going to refer to the muscle itself, and TP3 is going to refer down the leg to the carpus. Obviously, there can be other myofascial trigger points located in different areas, but these are just kind of the common ones that you'll see, and that will be covered in the literature specifically. But obviously, you can find a trigger point anywhere in any type of skeletal muscle, really. One thing in the research that I did find was that when they worked on canine cadavers and they cut the biceps tendon here, they found a few things. They found that when the limb was in a neutral position, roughly like this, that cranial movement, lateral movement, and medial movement were significantly increased. So the tendon is helping to resist those types of movement when it's in a neutral position, medial, lateral, and cranial. When they put the forelimb in a flexed position, cranial and lateral movement were increased, and when they extended it, then the medial movement was increased. Probably don't need to know that, but it does definitely play a role in those 3 types of movement: lateral, medial, and cranial. So that's definitely important to think about. And again, it seems like the most commonly injured area is going to be the tendon, typically the tendon of origin more often than the insertion, because of the stabilization role it's playing in the shoulder. And so you might get tendinitis, like an inflammation of the tendon, tenosynovitis, and like an inflammation of the tendon sheath, or some sort of tendinopathy where like the collagen in the tendon is breaking down. But just generally, if you remember like biceps tendon issues, that's probably good enough. So I think that pretty much covers what we want to talk about today for the canine biceps. Thanks so much for watching. There's actually a quiz, so go to the description. In the video description, there's a link to a quiz, so you can take it and see how you do, see how much you retained for the canine biceps. It's not a trick. There's no trick questions, so hopefully everything on there was covered in this video. So hopefully everyone will do well on it. Maybe post in the comments, let me know how you did, and that might tell me if there's things that I'm neglecting in the video that I can try to focus on more in the future if everyone's missing certain parts or aspects of the video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll be back shortly to talk about the canine brachialis and then the coracobrachialis, probably 2 separate videos. And I'll be mixing in a lot of different things along with the anatomy that relate to dogs and helping them live better lives. All right, thanks so much for watching.